The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as elderly Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell stepped onto her front porch with her usual cup of chamomile tea. At 78 years old, she had witnessed countless sunrises from this very spot, but today something felt different. A faint mewing sound drifted through the crisp October air, so soft she almost dismissed it as her imagination. But there it was again, a tiny cry for help that would soon unite an entire neighborhood in the most unexpected way. Eleanor set down her teacup and followed the sound toward the towering oak tree that had stood sentinel in her front yard for over a century. The ancient tree had weathered storms, seasons, and generations of families who had called this street home. But today, it held something precious and vulnerable in its highest branches. There, barely visible among the golden autumn leaves, was the smallest orange kitten Eleanor had ever seen. The tiny creature couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old, its fur a brilliant pumpkin orange that seemed to glow against the amber foliage. How it had managed to climb so impossibly high remained a mystery, but one thing was certain: it was too frightened and too small to make its way back down. Each pitiful meow tugged at Eleanor's heart, reminding her of the kitten she had rescued decades ago when her children were young. Eleanor immediately called the fire department, her hands trembling slightly as she dialed. The dispatcher, a kind woman named Patricia, explained that the department no longer responded to cat-and-tree calls unless there was immediate danger to human life. Budget cuts and policy changes had made such rescues a thing of the past. The disappointment in Eleanor's voice was palpable as she thanked Patricia and hung up. But Eleanor Hartwell was not one to give up easily. She had raised 3 children, survived the loss of her beloved husband Harold 5 years ago, and had been the neighborhood's unofficial problem solver for decades. She grabbed her phone and started calling every tree service company in the yellow pages. One after another, they declined. Too high, too dangerous, too expensive, insurance won't cover it. The kitten's cries seemed to grow weaker with each rejection. By noon, word had spread throughout the neighborhood through the invisible network that connects caring communities. First came Janet Rodriguez from next door, carrying a ladder that proved woefully inadequate for the task. Then appeared Tom and Susan Mitchell from across the street, followed by the Johnson family with their 3 young children. Soon, nearly 20 neighbors had gathered beneath the mighty oak, all craning their necks upward at the tiny orange speck that had captured their collective hearts. Young Emma Johnson, only 7 years old, tugged at her mother's sleeve and asked why no one could help the kitty. Her innocent question hung in the air like a challenge to the adults who had grown accustomed to hearing why things couldn't be done rather than finding ways to make them happen. It was then that David Chen, a software engineer who had recently moved to Maple Street, stepped forward with an idea that would change everything. David had been quietly observing from his front steps, his mind working through the problem like the analytical puzzles he solved at work every day. He remembered reading about a local tree climbing service that specialized in canopy research and storm damage assessment. Unlike the commercial tree services, they had the specialized equipment and expertise needed for high-altitude rescues. He quickly searched his phone and found Canopy Specialists, a small family-owned business run by a former forestry researcher named Sarah Martinez. When David called Sarah, she was initially hesitant. Her company typically worked on scientific projects and storm cleanup, not animal rescues. But when she heard the desperation in David's voice and learned about the neighborhood that had rallied together, something shifted in her heart. Sarah had grown up in a community where neighbors looked out for each other, and she recognized the same spirit in David's plea. She agreed to come take a look, though she couldn't promise anything. An hour later, Sarah arrived in a truck loaded with professional climbing gear, ropes, and safety equipment that looked like something from a mountaineering expedition. She was a petite woman in her 40s with calloused hands and kind eyes that immediately assessed both the tree and the kitten with expert precision. The crowd watched in respectful silence as she explained the challenges. The kitten was at least 60 feet up, the branches at that height were relatively thin, and any rescue attempt would need to be incredibly gentle to avoid frightening the animal into falling. But Sarah had a plan. She would use a technique called canopy access that involved carefully ascending the tree using a system of ropes and harnesses, then creating a safe pathway for descent. The process would take time, patience, and a very calm approach to avoid startling the kitten. As she began her meticulous preparation, the gathered neighbors organized themselves into a support system that would have made any community organizer proud. Eleanor appointed herself as the official communication coordinator, updating anyone who arrived about the rescue progress. The Johnson children drew pictures of the kitten and held them up like encouraging signs. Tom Mitchell ran home to get folding chairs for the elderly neighbors who wanted to stay and watch. Janet Rodriguez organized a potluck lunch that appeared as if by magic, with sandwiches, coffee, and homemade cookies that kept everyone's spirits high during the long afternoon. As Sarah began her ascent, the entire neighborhood held its collective breath. Hand over hand, she climbed with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years studying forest canopies. The orange kitten watched her approach with wide, frightened eyes but seemed to sense that help was finally coming. Sarah spoke in soft, reassuring tones as she drew closer, her voice barely audible to the crowd below but clearly having a calming effect on the tiny animal. The most challenging moment came when Sarah reached the kitten's branch. The little creature was exhausted from hours in the tree, dehydrated and weak, but still possessed enough feline instinct to be wary of this human invader in its precarious refuge. Sarah spent nearly 30 minutes simply talking to the kitten, letting it become accustomed to her presence while she set up the specialized rescue bag that would carry it safely to the ground. When Sarah finally secured the kitten in the soft mesh carrier and began her descent, the crowd erupted in cheers that could be heard 3 blocks away. Children jumped up and down, adults hugged strangers, and more than a few tears of relief were shed. But the most emotional moment came when Sarah reached the ground and gently transferred the kitten to Eleanor's waiting arms. The tiny orange bundle immediately began purring, a sound that seemed impossibly loud for such a small creature. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she cradled the kitten against her chest, feeling its rapid heartbeat slow to a more normal rhythm. She looked around at the faces of her neighbors, people she had known for years and others she was just meeting for the first time, and realized that something beautiful had happened on Maple Street that day. David stepped forward and quietly handed Eleanor a check to cover Sarah's rescue fee, but she waved it away with a smile. This rescue, she explained, was her gift to a community that had reminded her why she had chosen her profession in the first place. The neighbors insisted on covering her travel expenses, and someone suggested they should all contribute to the local animal shelter in honor of their newest 4-legged neighbor. As the sun began to set and the impromptu block party wound down, Eleanor made an announcement that surprised everyone. She had decided to adopt the kitten, whom little Emma Johnson had already christened Sunny for his bright orange coat. But more than that, she proposed that they make this gathering a monthly tradition, a neighborhood coffee morning where they could all stay connected and look out for each other just as they had looked out for one small kitten in need. The first official Maple Street coffee morning was held 4 weeks later, and Sunny served as the unofficial host, weaving between neighbors' legs and purring contentedly as if he had always belonged there. Sarah Martinez became a regular attendee, sharing stories from her tree-climbing adventures and teaching the children about forest ecology. David Chin discovered a talent for organizing community events, and the Johnsons started a little neighborhood newsletter that featured Sunny prominently on every front page. But perhaps the most beautiful transformation was in Eleanor herself. The woman who had started the day feeling the familiar ache of loneliness found herself at the center of a vibrant community of friends who genuinely cared about each other's well-being. Sunny had given her a purpose beyond her daily routines, and the rescue had given her something even more precious, a reminder that extraordinary kindness often begins with ordinary people choosing to care. This story reminds us that the smallest acts of compassion can create ripples that transform entire communities. One tiny kitten brought together strangers, turned neighbors into friends, and showed everyone on Maple Street that when we choose to help rather than walk away, magic happens. Sometimes the rescue mission isn't just about saving someone else, it's about rediscovering the connections that make us all a little less alone in this world. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who believes in the power of kindness. Subscribe to Pure Kindness Stories for more heartwarming tales that celebrate the extraordinary compassion of ordinary people. Because in a world that can sometimes feel overwhelming, we all need reminders that there are still communities like Maple Street, where neighbors look out for each other and where no cry for help, no matter how small, goes unanswered. Together, we can create more streets, more neighborhoods, and more moments where kindness wins.